We had a hellacious thunderstorm last night, and while listening to the rumbling and the wind and the torrential rain, I was reminded of a passage from my most recently completed novel called The Communion of Shadows, which is about four friends who get together on a thundery night and start telling ghost stories, since that sort of weather seems to be appropriate for that time-honored activity. One of the characters, though, is of the more prosaic sort and says, "Why would ghosts walk on a thundery night? I didn't want to go out on a thundery night while I was alive. Why would that change after I was dead?" Which seems like good logic, doesn't it? We attribute all sorts of tendencies to ghosts despite having no evidence really to go by. Supposedly they stick around if they have unfinished business, or if they died tragically, or if they're seeking revenge, and for some reason are almost always seen in the clothes they died in. So I suppose that given the odds, I'm most likely to be seen as a ghost wearing a disreputable pair of cargo shorts and no shirt. Despite my general reluctance to believe in ghosts, the evidence still seems to me to be regrettably slim. I've been an aficionado of the paranormal since I was a teenager. I grew up on books with names like 20 True Tales of Terror. And the story I'm about to tell you, which is one of the scariest tales I've ever heard, comes from John Canning's excellent collection called 50 Great Ghost Stories, which, according to the message written on the inside front cover, which says October 29th, 1977, "Mon cher ami, mieux vaut tard que jamais, ton ami Amélie," was given to me 3 days after my 17th birthday. Which I read voraciously, as I was wont to do with collections like that, but none of the stories stuck with me the way the 19th century tale of Nurse Black did. The story comes our way via the English theater figures Charles Keene and his wife Ellen, but the central characters are Ellen's sister, Anne, and her husband, John Kemble Chapman. John, Anne, and their 11 children lived in London in the 1850s, but London of the time was a smelly, crime-ridden place, and so they decided that it wasn't a very healthy place to raise all those kids, so they bought a house in the country. They settled on a home in Cheshire in Hertfordshire. It seemed perfect. It was picturesque and spacious, perfect for a lot of kids, and at the time was about 200 years old. So in due time, the house was purchased, and the family moved in, and for a while nothing untoward happened. It was only when the Chapmans were expecting guests that the first events occurred that eventually were to impel them to sell the house. For wealthy individuals, John and Anne employed few servants. Anne was a strong-minded and strong-willed person and preferred to see the housework done by herself. So one day, Anne was making up the oak bedroom, a room that had been left unoccupied for guests, and she realized she wasn't alone. Standing near the window was a young woman in antiquated dress, with a shawl over a silk petticoat, with an eager expression looking out of the window as if she were expecting someone. She didn't seem to be paying any attention to Anne. Anne, on the other hand, was seized with a sudden panic. She said, as she told her brother-in-law Charles Keene later, "I felt as if I were looking at something that I shouldn't be seeing." So she put her hands over her eyes for a moment, and when she removed them, the figure was gone. Anne chalked it up to fatigue and nerves, and for a while was able to convince herself that she'd been a victim of her own imagination. A few days later, though, one of the servants came to Anne in hysterics, saying she'd been taking the trash out of the back of the house, and she'd seen an old woman staring at her with, quote, "an expression of awful malignance." She was hideously ugly, the maid said. Well, Anne was able to calm the young woman down, until 3 days later, Maria Chapman, one of Anne's older daughters, came to her saying that during the night she'd been awakened by an ugly old lady peering through the door at her. During this entire time, John Kemble Chapman, Anne's husband, had been away on business in London. But before he got back, she did something which I have to say I admire for its bravery. She got the servants together, along with the older children, and did a thorough search of the house from top to bottom, looking in every closet, every cupboard, every nook and cranny that they could find. They found nothing, but afterwards, as she was going down the stairs, she heard footsteps following her. She turned around. The staircase was empty. John came home a few days later, and Anne, thoroughly unnerved by this time, understandably enough, told her husband about what had happened, and he instituted a second thorough search of the house, again turning up nothing. But events started to accelerate. John found that he was being followed around by footsteps as well, which he described as being soft, steady, and infinitely menacing. he took to carrying a loaded pistol around. And then shortly thereafter, all of the servants quit en masse because they said that while they had been dining in the servants' quarters, the door had opened and then closed to admit no one. One of the only remaining staff, a Mrs. Tewin, agreed to stay on and, in fact, to sleep in the same room as Anne. And this was to precipitate one final event that led to the families abandoning their house. Anne was sound asleep one night and was awakened to hear Mrs. Tewin crying out, "Wake me, wake me." The old woman was thrashing about in her sleep, but seemed to be unable to wake up. Anne shook her by the shoulder and finally was able to rouse her, and Mrs. Tewin told about a dream she'd had. In the dream, Mrs. Tewin said she'd been in the oak bedroom. There had been two figures there along with her. One was the young woman, a woman with dark hair and wearing a shawl, looking out of the window. The other, an elderly woman with a nightcap and long, straggly gray hair. She had, Mrs. Tewin said, an evil expression. Well, for the first time, the ghost decided to communicate with some of the living inhabitants of the house. The old woman first said, "What have you done with the child, Emily?" The young woman turned around and said, "Oh, I didn't kill him. He lived. And he grew up and eventually joined a regiment and went to India." The young woman then turned toward Mrs. Tewin as if seeing her for the first time and said, "I've never spoken to a mortal before. My name is Emily Black. This old woman is Nurse Black. She's not really a member of the family, but has been with us so long that we considered her to be one." But at that point, the old woman stood up and put her hand on Mrs. Tewin's shoulder. The pain was excruciating, and that was when she began to thrash around and yell, "Wake me up, wake me up," eventually leading to Anne Chapman doing so. The next day, Anne decided to make some inquiries, so she went to the Cheshire Town Records Office and found out that some years before, the house had been occupied by a Mrs. Ravenhall, who had a niece named Emily Black. She couldn't find out anything more about them, and none of the people in the town seemed to know them. Understandably, the Chapmans were becoming increasingly desperate to find out what the hell was going on here, and Mrs. Chapman, who either was incredibly brave or incredibly crazy, or possibly both, decided to spend a night alone in the oak bedroom, since that seemed to be the focal point of the haunting. And indeed, she saw the young woman's figure again, this time staring disconsolately at a spot on the floor. Well, Anne decided to do something about that, so she hired a carpenter to pull up the floorboards. Underneath was a hollowed-out space, but there was nothing in it. At that point, the Chapmans had had enough, so they decided to put the house on the market, and eventually it was sold. But who bought it and what happened, if anything, afterwards is not recorded. I think what appeals to me about this story is its open-endedness. I'm sure you've all heard ghost stories of the type of a young man driving his car down an old country road and coming across a young woman standing by the side of the road who obviously needed a ride, and he gives her a ride. She tells him that she's cold, so he lends her his jacket. Then, when he gets to his destination, he finds she's disappeared, makes inquiries, and finds out that a young woman of that description had died the year previous, and so he goes to her grave and finds his jacket folded up on the gravestone. Those types of stories have always struck me as being completely unbelievable, even when I was in my much more gullible youth. They seem too pat, too neat. The story of Nurse Black, though, has no easy explanation. It's full of loose ends. Even the hollowed-out space under the floorboards, which could have provided some kind of easy tie-up, turned out to be empty. And the Chapmans never did figure out who the ghosts were or what they wanted. Now, I hasten to add that it's not that I actually believe the story. Charles Keene, who was after all a thespian, shared many a glass of brandy with his friends, scaring the absolute shit out of them with this tale. The man obviously knew how to spin a good yarn, and I'm sure that what he did was take a much more prosaic story and embellish it for the entertainment of his audience. But the twisty, unresolved messiness of the tale makes it 100 times scarier. Makes it seem true. Man, it should be true. So, there you have it. My favorite ghost story. And whether you're a doubter or a true believer or don't care much either way, keep looking at things through a skeptical eye, keep asking good questions, and keep asking for evidence. But if you're walking down some stairs sometime in a dark, thundery night, and you hear footsteps behind you, turn around and say, "Emily Black, is that you?" Who knows? Maybe you'll get an answer. If you enjoyed this video, please give us a thumbs up. The resources are down there, and please subscribe. Thanks.